And welcome back to this week's live edition of the Wellbeing Show. I'm your host, Noel Mcdermott. I've got a great guest, Silva Neves. I think I said that right. He'll tell me in 1 second. And a really sort of odd coincidence in that Silva's French and in London, and I'm a Londoner and I'm in France. So there you go. And he's very jealous of the fact. I might look a bit orange, but it's not orange. It's actually a red Irishman's face that has been grilled into a lobster-like impression in the south of France sun. But there you go. So this evening, I'm chatting with Silva. I'm really excited about it. Really going to be great, particularly as Pride Month has just started, and we're going to be looking at the LGBTQ plus community. I think I said that right. I don't think I missed anything out of the alphabet there, but I'll know soon enough. I'm sure I'll be put in my place very kindly and very gently. And we're going to be chatting about Silva's life and his professional experience. And given it's Pride Month, his expertise in psychosexual and trauma-based therapy, and also challenging some of the dogma and myths around hypersexuality and those types of issues as they apply to certain sections of that community. We'll get to that in a minute. Just to remind you, it's live. I've had some technical problems over here in France, so I'm not too worried about it, but my computer's tethered to my phone. I don't know what happens if somebody calls me when my computer's tethered to my phone. I have no idea. But if you do call, I guess we'll find out. We'll know what happens. But the number is 07506 319 745. As I'm in Europe at the moment, Mr. Brexit here, I should add it's +44 7506 319 745. Probably best to drop me a line on WhatsApp or drop us a message in one of the streaming platforms or on either Facebook Live or YouTube. And James, who is freezing away in his cold, rainy flat in London, will check it out and let me know if there's any messages. I think that's enough for me. You might see some flashes. I'm in the south of France. I think some sort of film star is here and they're taking photos. So if you see flashes, that's what's happening. What a terrible life I lead, isn't it? So there you go. Over to you, Silva. Hello. Welcome to Montpellier.
Yes. I wish I could be there as well.
I'm sure you do. But Wanstead is a lovely place, we have to say, which is where you are based.
It is. And today it's not raining.
Ah. Shall I rush back?
No.
So, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on. As you said, it's the beginning of Pride Month, and you have a professional background as well as personal background in the LGBTQ plus community, and so we'll be delving into that and sort of understanding some of the issues. And I have to say, I'm going to kick this off. I don't mean this as a controversial statement, but I think mental health services have been particularly appalling around these communities historically, labelling perfectly healthy human behaviour, loving human behaviour as pathologies and illnesses. So I think we shall go into that a little bit and try and knock some of that nonsense on the head, and maybe even look at some of the issues around transsexual issues and some of the issues around conversion therapy, which is still, I'm not even calling it therapy, conversion torture. It's not therapy because you provide therapy for somebody who has mental health problems, and being gay is not a mental health problem. End of story. That's it. Full stop. End of conversation. So it's not therapy. It's some sort of ridiculous sort of horrible thing, but I'm sure we'll cover those types of issues and explore them, and explore issues of cultural competence as well, because I think it's really important to think about those things, about the background of the therapist and the culture they bring, and whether that makes them competent with their target sort of group of patients. Does that seem reasonable? Cover those types of things?
Sounds great.
Okay, cool. Well, let's kick off with the obvious fact that you weren't born and bred in Wanstead, I'm guessing, not with that accent.
No. No, I was born in the French Alps on the border of Switzerland. So growing up with lovely fresh air in the middle of the mountains. That was very nice, growing up in that way. But yes, of course, when I became a teenager, it started to feel very lonely up in the mountains. At the time, there was not. I was born in 1979, just a time where not only there was just not a lot of visibility for LGBTQ people, but also it was just right at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. So the only things I heard about being gay were something to do with disease and people dying, and something to avoid at all costs. So that's kind of how, the kind of like climate that I grew up with, really. So,
not a particularly welcoming climate. I'm a little bit older than you, as people will be able to tell. And I remember when AIDS hit, and what I remember is I lost a lot of friends. I worked in theatre at the time, which was a very mixed group of people. And it was absolutely horrific. And on top of it was the appalling sort of stigma that existed. And that was directed, a torrent of abuse, really, that was directed at gay men. And I remember I might cry at some of these memories, but that's okay. I remember one of my friends who died, and he was in the hallway, and we covered him in his sort of duvet because we wanted to give him a bit of respect and privacy. And the coroner came round and refused to touch him.
Yeah, awful.
And he insisted we picked up his body and put it in the body bag, and this type of stuff, and it was all nonsense. It was all stigma. It was awful,
really awful. And it was a good opportunity.
As a kid, which you were, what that must have been like when you were getting those images, because I guess you also, by that point, knew where your leanings were lying, as it were.
I knew one of those that knew very early that I wasn't straight. Yeah. I didn't have the language that I was gay yet at the time. I didn't know what it meant, but I certainly knew that I wasn't like the other boys, doing all the other boys things and being, like the boyfriend girlfriend thing that even in primary school we talk about, that just really was never. I could never really relate to that. And I remember as young as primary school, I had a crush on a boy. So it was, I knew from a very early age. But then, of course, when I became a teenager and you start to mature, and I could then identify words to it, the word gay, that was at the time associated with disease. Yes. And with something that we had to avoid because there was people just dying, but not dying because of a virus. It was dying because of sin.
That's right. That's right. And France is still quite Catholic, sort of, and I should imagine very Catholic in way back then. It's still quite Catholic as it is now. So
yes, I think France is a country of contradiction because it's very Catholic, and at the same time they really promote secularism, and so it's kind of like confusing, basically, when you grow up in places of contradictions.
But it is very Catholic, and I think particularly, and I know the Alps well. There's strong religious overtones in the small community within the Alps, yes. And you have shrines everywhere to water spouts and to water spouts. For people who don't know, when you're in mountains, water saves your life. So these springs emerge in the mountains. You know this, Silva, until you, yes, and they get literally covered in shrines because I forget the name, the French word for it, but it's a word that means life or something. God gave life here or something, and that's everywhere. Sort of extraordinary strong culture in these small alpine villages.
And especially in the village where basically it's the church in the middle of it, and people get together on a Sunday, after the church thing and whatever. So it's kind of like embedded in. And
for people who don't know about village life, is that nothing is There's no privacy in the village.
There's no privacy in the village at all, but
No.
also everybody is expected to be the same. So anything that is different or a little bit out of place is not really welcome. And French people kind of really love their routine, and they love just things to always be the same. They don't like change very much.
Yes.
And so after quite some time, when I became a teenager in the village, in the mountains, far away from any cities, I really did feel like literally the only gay person.
That's right. Really I'm the only gay in the village, and you were that before the program. So you were that only gay.
I was.
Yes. And sort of, we're laughing about it, but I imagine it was quite challenging at times.
It was very challenging. And also at the time, there was no iPhones, or there was no Facebooks or anything. So it's not like I could find a Facebook group to meet like-minded people or whatever. It really felt very, very lonely.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine you were lonely. Did you also sort of experience yourself as bad in some way because of the messages, or did you feel okay about yourself?
It was like self-esteem and learning to love myself was a long journey that I started in my early 20s in therapy, because as well as being lonely and being different, I just suffered a lot of bullying at school as well. So my school years were just not the best years of my life, that's for sure.
Sure. And
there was no visibility, there was no
I was going to say
nothing else. So it was literally like I was just on my own. People bullying me for not being the manly or the boyish or whatever it is that they were saying. And so it was kind of like, okay, I just had to fend for myself really, and not talk to anyone, and just carried on, and then left as soon as I could.
And I guess I want to make this point because I think it is really important, because people are attacking these issues in schools at the moment, but there wasn't a curriculum that would open up the issues and talk about them in a compassionate way, and discuss sexuality as a choice, as something that people could feel about themselves, and that love is love, and that there was no right or wrong. It was sort of about you as an individual discovering who you were and what you liked and what you didn't like. There was nothing like that going on in the school. There was no positive images of probably sexuality full stop, I imagine. There was there
was nothing.
Yeah. And I raised that issue because I think schools do have those curriculums now. They have curriculums about life, they have curriculums about love, they have curriculums about inclusion, and there is a move to attack that at the moment.
Although still very slow, but yes, it's moving.
Yeah, but there is, there are counterculture movements now as well that would want to take away those enlightened curriculums. How would it have helped you, do you think, as a kid, if teachers were talking openly about this and were normalizing sort of other cultures?
It would have been such a difference, such a big difference, if I was told as a child that there was just not only one way to be a boy, that there was diverse sexualities, diverse gender expressions, diverse ways of being in relationships or connecting with other people. It would have made such a big difference.
Yeah, I mean,
none of that.
My boy, who's sleeping in a room next door, or should be sleeping, better be sleeping, otherwise he's in trouble. But I remember when we took him to London Pride, which will be at the end of this month on the 1st of July, and just talking to him, he's French, and that's why I'm in France, and talking to him about that love is love, and he was on my shoulders and he was meeting people, and he I don't think he's made up a firm idea yet of what his sexuality is. He's 11. He hasn't really talked about it. We shall see. Whatever is working for him will work for him. We will love him no matter what. But that's quite a huge shift, and that's really important. I think that that is available. We're going to talk about Pride a bit because it's coming up, and the role of sort of activism. But I think it's really important for people to understand the isolation and loneliness and the damage that does to children who are left carrying a sense of themselves as wrong or bad.
Yes, a big shame, actually.
Yes.
And that's that sticks around a lot. Even that, like you were saying about the 80s and the AIDS epidemic, still now in 2022, even though people don't die from AIDS any longer, there is still the language, the stigma language that persists when people call themselves clean when they are HIV negative, and which implies that HIV positive is dirty or something undesirable, and that language still is lingering, and that's just so much harder to tackle, really, because that's part of mindset. And laws can change, medicine can change, a lot of things can change, but the stigma and the shame can stick around for much longer.
And as you say, it wasn't about infection, was it? The stigma wasn't about infection, because the reality is that the highest infection rates for HIV these days are in the straight community.
Yes, now, yes.
Exactly. There's no outcry about that. There's no pointing fingers and saying. And to be honest, if it had infected the straight community first, when it came, again, there wouldn't have been the same stigma. So I think there was.
That's right.
It was definitely something about the lifestyle of the poor people who were catching this awful illness, as it was. It isn't now, as you say. It's largely managed. I mean, it's not such a big issue these days in terms of the sort of medical responses. But rather than being seen as victims, people were seen as perpetrators, and that was because of their lifestyle and the way they were living their life, and nothing else. It was because they were gay. That's it.
That's right.
And that's the only thing that was going on. So you were in this village in the French Alps, and you knew it wasn't for you. It wasn't going to be where you were going to spend your life. At what point did you know, I'm leaving, I'm moving somewhere else, and sort of what? I
was counting the days till I was 18, and
really?
as soon as I was an adult and I could just do whatever I wanted, I basically left.
Okay.
So yes, and I went straight to London, and just to visit, because I always had an idea that London was progressive, it was creative, lots of things was going on, it was multicultural, so basically the complete opposite to the French Alps, and it didn't disappoint. And so I went, and I never left.
Okay, and so you sort of rocked up into Soho, I believe.
That's right, yes. And suddenly seeing so many people just like me, and that was, a brain explosion on the first time I arrived in Soho, thinking, oh my gosh, all these people actually do exist. That's amazing.
Yeah, and it was a safe place. I mean, although Soho is still branded as LGBT plus, it's not as clearly that anymore, and some of those communities moved on. We'll come to that in a minute. I'm intrigued as to because you didn't go to like a metropolitan city in France. You went to the UK, which is an interesting choice. And I can understand London, New York, but why not Paris? I mean, it would also be quite, in some ways, I guess, as welcoming. There are areas of Paris that would have been as welcoming.
Yes, Paris is good for LGBT, but it was just too close. I just really needed to leave the French culture and just experience something completely different.
Okay, and so in a sense, make yourself alien and anonymous somewhere.
That's right. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I can understand the attraction of that. And did you tell your family at some point that you were gay, and was that ever?
Well, I came out just before going to London, just in case something went wrong. So it was kind of like my my safety net in some ways. But it was, of course, when you come out, it's a big event for any gay people that comes out, and it was a big event for me to actually verbalize the words, really, and to make them official almost. But for my mother, it was a non-event, really, because I think she really suspected it for a very, very long time. That I was gay when, she probably saw me playing with Barbies when I was 5, and she probably already thought. Yes, exactly. She did have a cry, I think, for one day, knowing that, she was probably not going to be a grandmother or whatever, because at the time you couldn't adopt.
Yeah.
But I think after she got over her one day cry, she kind of thought, I always knew anyway. So,
and you're my son, I love you, end of story.
That's right, yes. And my father was a non-event, but my father's kind of like doesn't really, and I think my existence was a non-event to him. So,
so it wasn't because you were gay; it was just because.
Yeah, it was whatever.
It wasn't into being available anyway. So whatever.
Yes, that's right.
As unavailable with you being gay as it was. Right. So okay. Well, consistent at least.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, with my father, I know where I stand. That's for sure. Very consistent.
Yeah, you stand somewhere in his shadow and sort of in the dark, and that's where you should stay. Okay, fair enough. That's quite sort of that's quite a country sort of French attitude, male attitude from that era towards children. To be honest, that's not.
Well, my father was Portuguese. He's still a Portuguese, but the culture in Portugal is kind of like the same a little bit, when it comes to masculinity.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, I think, because guys of that sort of generation, very much is about you do the job, you give your wife the money, she does the home, she does the children, you don't get involved, and you stay away from it, that sort of thing. So
that's right.
Yeah, which is unfortunate, I think, because having a child in my life has transformed it. And having that role is one of the most beautiful things that's ever happened to me. So if I'd sort of followed my father's footsteps, I'd have avoided any of that like the plague, because my father behaved as though it was a prison sentence rather than anything else. And I can affirm it's not. It's actually quite freeing and beautiful. So
but a lot of parents are like this. Of course, as therapists, we know it, isn't it? It's just so common to have parents that are just don't realize the beauty in getting to know another life and creating another life and getting to know another life and really investing in it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's also, it is quite a significant issue in the LGBT community as well, in terms, and you briefly mentioned it, it wasn't possible to adopt at one point. To some extent, that's changed, and
yes.
And also some of the medical technologies changed so that it is possible to use IVF to have genetically your own children.
Plenty more opportunities now, which is wonderful.
It's great, isn't it? It's wonderful.
Yes.
And so, but it was always, I think, one of the issues that certainly older gay, lesbian couples, stable couples, in the days when there were less enlightened policies around this, it was one of the sadnesses that people felt.
Yes, and I think the theme of family is really quite important for LGBTQ people, because often the family of origin isn't the best one for them, and not one where they can thrive, and sometimes actually really quite traumatic. And but what the communities have now kind of embraced, or when I say now, always embraced in some ways, is what we call the family of choice. And I think that's very, very powerful. And sometimes it is under the rainbow umbrella, the rainbow flag can be a beacon of hope, a beacon of there's a family of choice somewhere behind that flag. Yes. And so and creating those kind of like micro communities or big friendship groups or small friendship groups can be then feeling like family.
Sure. And that's what you discovered when you moved to London and discovered Soho, was I guess this sense of being part of, belonging, comfortable in your own skin, and the sort of who you were as a human being, the acceptance of you.
But there was a sense of belonging, that's for sure. And there was a sense that I could really identify and associate with the rainbow flag, which became a place of belonging. So that was good for me. But in terms of having a sense of family of choice, I think for me it was, but I think for a lot of LGBTQ people, it's a harder, longer road, because in order to do that, we have to first understand that we're worthy of love, and therefore understand that other people can love us. And that can be, if we grow up in a place that we feel that we are unlovable or even worthless. And that's not necessarily because of bad parenting, sometimes it is, but just the fact that a lot of LGBTQ people grow up with society telling us that we are wrong and bad. It can be, it's not always straightforward to allow ourselves to be loved.
Yeah. And what was your journey on that like? Because you said that your self-esteem wasn't great when you moved. You were running away, and you're hopefully running to something. And there've been tragic stories of sort of LGBT community people running away into danger. And that used to be classic in London, to be honest. It was sort of young men in particular became victims of predators and so on. But what was your journey like in terms of discovering that you were inherently a lovable and loving person? Sort of, how did you get to that point, do you think?
Well, I was very lucky because I made a decision early on to go to therapy.
Oh,
But a lot of people don't think of going to therapy, or therapy can be inaccessible for some people. For me, it was, when I arrived in London, I just didn't have very much money or whatever, but I would rather spend money on the therapy than money on anything else, really. So I did, found every pennies I could to do that. And that's really, now thinking back, I'm thinking, wow, I was really young, and I did go to therapy at the time, committed to it at the time that a lot of people wouldn't have. So only thinking back now, I'm thinking that was quite courageous to do it at the time. But I think that's really what really worked for me to
let's
work
talk
on my stuff early.
Let's talk about, you obviously found an enlightened therapist, I guess, from the community.
Yes.
Right. Okay. You didn't find one of the less enlightened therapists who wanted to pathologize you and change you.
No, I think I was lucky because I just didn't know where to go, where to find.
Well, I mean, seriously, it's a very significant problem. So,
yes,
but you found somebody in the community, word of mouth. I guess.
Well, I went to a website called Pink Therapy, which is a website where there's a register for LGBTQ therapists. So that's where I went first, and I was very lucky. And now I'm actually very proud that I'm a clinical associate of Pink Therapy. And so I kind of like went full circle. But at the time, this is where I went, and I was lucky because a lot of people still now, I hear a report of LGBTQ people really wanting emotional help or psychological help, and they go to a therapist where they get further pathologized and make things worse for them. So that's very tragic.
Yeah. So Pink Therapy is a website. James can put it out there. What's the URL for it?
pinktherapy.com, I think, or .org.
Okay.
I think it's both.
You can find that and post that out. So let's talk about the dynamics of a vulnerable person who presents with what looks like mental health issues, who might be gay, lesbian, or trans. What as a professional, sort of, how would you understand that presentation in terms of the sort of psychology, the depression, the anxiety, maybe the self-harm, maybe the suicidal thoughts, etc., which would be pretty typical and common, really, as and how would you think about it and frame it? And how might somebody who's not from the community or is not culturally competent also think and frame about it? What would be the sort of significant differences, do you think?
Well, I think my main stance is to see people as not broken, basically.
Okay.
And even though a lot of the time people can come to therapy and start to say, I'm broken, I'm this and that, it's awful, and put lots of kind of self-diagnosis or labels on them, as defective labels on them, I tend to just not really engage with that very much. Of course, I listen to them, but I don't see that anybody's broken. I see that people have problems and come to therapy is because of things that were done to them, and that has an impact on them because of what was done to them. And of course, with the LGBTQ people in particular, there's plenty of things that is done to us on a regular basis, just because the world is still heterosexual and heteronormative. And heteronormative meaning that the assumption is that heterosexual is the norm and everything else is alternative or weird.
Yeah.
And so because this is still the world that we live in today, that means that we have ongoing stuff done to us from society, even if we have a good childhood. But on top of that, of course, a lot of people don't have such a great childhood because they don't have such great parents. And so it all compounds to people feeling bad about themselves, depression, anxiety, self-harm, whatever.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing you right, you would be thinking about the context in which your patient had experienced things that led to reactions such as anxiety and depression and self-hatred, yes?
That's right, yes.
Okay. And you wouldn't necessarily be saying, okay, you have depression, you have anxiety, you have deliberate self-harm. You sort of more understand it as, well, these are responses that I can understand within context of you being treated badly.
That's right. And you kind of, if they tell me a little bit about their story, then we'll just look at how it makes sense. Because it usually it makes sense that they get to where they are at and they have a certain kind of emotional problems because something made it that way. It's an impact on something. It's a reaction on something. Yeah. It's a symptom of something. It's not because you're broken or you're bad or you have to get fixed.
There's an old. It's not an old. I don't know how old it is, but there's a joke with there's usually comes as a meme on Instagram with a picture of Freud's head. Not a great hero of mine, but nevertheless, it makes the joke funny. So you have a picture of Freud, and there's a saying underneath that says, "Before you diagnose yourself as depressed or anxious, make sure you're not surrounded by dickheads."
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. That's right. Yes. And actually, a lot of the time, this is what it is. It's that people just don't connect with the right people for them. They don't connect with people, with maybe other queer people where they can feel completely relaxed and feel like they don't have to be vigilant about, if they're going to have an attack coming around the corner. And exactly. that makes such a big difference to people's mental health.
Yeah, because their stress levels go down and they suddenly feel connected to other human beings. And we're designed to connect with other human beings. We're social animals, for God's sake, right?
Exactly. Absolutely.
And if we're not allowed to connect to other human beings in a self way, that will cause damage.
Yes, that's right. And, we live with hypervigilance because the world out there is not one that is always good for us still now. So
we don't get around the bush. It's quite, I can't think of anywhere in the UK where it would be safe for two men or two women to walk around, obviously sort of as a couple holding hands, doing anything that a straight couple might do, etc.
Yeah. Exactly. Just the simple act of holding your partner's hand is something that we have to very carefully consider. And every single time, scanning the environment, making sure that there's no potential threat before we can actually make the decision to hold hand. Heterosexual people never have to even think about it.
Yeah. And there are some places, so Soho, for example, I mean, sort of during the Pride March, for example, which is very big sort of, and during Pride Month, there will become safe places. Certain employers are becoming safer. Mm-hmm. I think, there are employers which are now having more progressive policies and stopping bullying. Schools are becoming a bit safer, or some schools are. So there are policies that are pushing towards that. So we should say, progress has been made. I don't want people to get their backs up and think, it's not that. I don't think that's what I'm hearing from you anyway, but I just want to say that. But there's
a lot of stuff, so many things happening now which really, really wonderful in terms of visibility, in terms of discussions. So it's really great.
But coming back to that point, and I think this is a really important human point, that two people who love each other should be allowed to walk hand in hand. It's such a simple, basic thing, holding your lover's hand or holding a child's hand, or this thing that, we all know how difficult it was to lose that during the pandemic. I mean, every one of us knows that and can understand how that feels not to have that simple skin contact, because during the pandemic we weren't allowed to do it except with a very small, and just how upsetting that was. And I think it's really important. Tell me about hypervigilance for people that don't understand it. I know what you mean by hypervigilance, but tell me about hypervigilance and why. You've repeated it several times now, and I agree with you. It's a very, very serious problem. Tell me about it and what it does to people and some of the patients that you see.
It's kind of like always being on guard, so not really completely fully relaxed when you are out there. And that's part of what we call minority stress. And minority stress is this kind of small micro stress that we get, but we get it every day. And we can get it in every single setting. So for example, if you move house and you go to a different house, there might be a coming out with the neighbors, because if you move with your same-sex partner, that can create some stress, or how they're going to react, the partners, if you go to an employer, or if if you go to a party and suddenly somebody's assuming that you're straight and ask an awkward question about who you're married to or the name of your girlfriend, that kind of stuff creates small little stress. And those things that we get on a regular basis. So it means that the nervous system is kind of charged on a regular basis about looking around and making sure that we can be safe. And there are, as you say, some pockets of times where we don't have to be like this. For example, if we're in Soho, or if we're in our own home, or if we are with other queer people or LGBT people, when we feel completely relaxed, then that's a chance for us to relax our nervous system. But most of the time, it's activated.
Okay. And what impact does that have on people having that hyperactivated nervous system?
That at some point people have to find some ways to soothe it. And so usually the way that people soothe it is with alcohol or with drugs or with other kind of behaviors, whether it's kind of like going on Instagram and scrolling it for forever, or or being in relationships, all sorts of different things. So it's
for people who like the terms and the language and want to go in, we're talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic.
That's right. Yes.
Sympathetic nervous system being the activated. We need it to be able to do things. Without it, we wouldn't be able to move. The parasympathetic being the opposite, where we can decompress, relax, and the parasympathetic leads us to be able to sleep and be comfortable with each other and things like that. When you have an overactive sympathetic nervous system, it produces, as you said, stress, which are stress hormones. Which are things like cortisol and adrenaline, and long-term overuse of cortisol can have quite disastrous consequences, leading to increased risk of all sorts of illnesses.
Yes,
it's linked to increased risk of cancer, internal organ failure, mental health problems, long-term mental health problems. Stress is also implicated in the activation of any underlying significant or serious mental health problems. So if somebody's born with a genetic predisposition towards bipolar, give them lots of stress and you'll switch that bipolar on pretty much guaranteed. Mm-hmm. So this is the type of thing that happens, right?
That's right. And also, even if there is no kind of like physical disease out of it, sometimes there is, but the everyday quality of life can be diminished because of that ongoing stress and that cortisol, the body flooded in cortisol. So that means that sometimes we can just get burnt out, we can get exhausted, we can get irritable, we can, all sorts of things that can make our sensory elements of enduring life a lot more difficult.
Yeah,
and with that, of course, problems with when you can't relax, then it's problems with intimate relationships, of course, and then sexual problems and all this other stuff.
And then, and as you pointed out, some of the unhelpful coping strategies, alcohol, drugs, maybe hypersexuality as well, those types of things that people use to try and calm themselves down.
That's right. Yes.
And they may work for a short time, but they never work long term. That's the bottom line here, isn't it? That those.
Yes, they can relieve the stress momentarily, but then it creates more problems over time. So yes.
I want to, if you don't mind, just because I think there's a whole area called sex addiction. I don't know if you've heard of this term.
Oh yes.
And it's a really problematic area because there's a political, economic push towards creating sex addiction as a real thing, when it's really questionable whether it is or not. And then the sort of agenda behind it is that there are rehabs that make a lot of money out of it, sort of bringing people in and charging them through the nose for services that are suspect, really. Particularly in the US, where the terminology sex addiction has taken hold in DSM and things like that. I would prefer the term hypersexuality. I don't know which term you prefer, so I'd be interested to know. But also, it has been something that has been really inappropriately labelled within the gay male community, or certain parts of the gay male community, which have their own sort of openness about sexual contact and has often been pathologized. Are you okay to talk about that a little bit? And just
I'm very happy to talk about that. I wrote a book about it. So
yeah,
yes. So well, for me, really, the term I use, it's not the best term, but the term I use is compulsive sexual behavior, because that's the term that's the term of the ICD-11. That's part of the World Health Organization, and they came up with that term in 2018. And so I've been using that term, and I agree with you that any term that's not addiction is a better term, because addiction is a disease word. It's a pathology, and it's when you try to pathologize gay men, as you were saying, especially with a disease word that actually is not scientifically endorsed, it can actually do a lot of harm to the gay community. So, because as we have talked about today, gay people have been pathologized all over the place unduly with their sexual behaviors, sexual attraction, and so on. And sex addiction just puts an extra layer of pathology, and that can be very harmful. And, if you read the thing about sex addiction that's the worst, apart from, as you say, filling up expensive clinics and making a lot of money to those clinics.
It horrifies me, to be honest, but it's the truth.
Yes, it is. It's that usually the treatment, one of the common things of recommendation in addiction is 12-step programs.
Yes, the so-called Minnesota model, which
that's
is
right, and
suspect as well.
Yes, and the Sex Addict Anonymous, or the Sex and Love Addict Anonymous, if you actually look at the material, it's very, very, very heteronormative, and what they consider as healthy sexuality is actually most gay men or people in the LGBTQ community as a wider group would fall out of that tight box of healthy. So meaning that they would be perceived as unhealthy when they are actually very healthy.
Yeah, particularly aspects of the SLA, Sex and Love Addicts, that use the what's called the HOW program, which is very prescriptive about different types of sexual contact and how many, and issues around abstinence from, which I mean, I find quite bizarre. And I say that as somebody who, I'm in recovery, in 12-step recovery, and I'm very suspicious of these labels and these terms. I've used it for substances, for alcohol. It's helped me a lot. I'm very grateful for it. I've also been to SLA meetings, so I know exactly what you're talking about, and I find them really strange places. Again, I sort of want people who are listening to hear this. I'm very grateful for everything I've received from those communities, but there are big problems with things like the Minnesota model, which is the application of 12-step models onto therapy, usually psychodynamic therapy, and it's sort of rammed down people's throats whether they want it or not. And if it doesn't work, people are told you're the one that's wrong. We haven't broken your ego enough.
Yes, I really dislike that. The fact that if the 12-step don't work, they blame the people for not doing the steps properly, absolutely. And that's not great. So and as you say, it's very, very prescriptive. But it's sold as that one cure, that one size fits all kind of thing. You follow the step and you'll be fine. And for a lot of people, they just don't get on with it. But what they do is that they get blamed for it, and then they feel more broken, and it's very bad. Since I've become quite gobby about criticizing 12-step programs, which I think is around 2018, I started to speak up about that. I've had countless and countless of emails and phone calls from people to say it re-traumatized me. It made things worse for me. But the problem is that because of shame, those people don't speak up because of shame. They speak to me, but they don't speak up out there because of the fear of being even more shamed. And 12-step programs have not been questioned enough. It's still the kind of like the go-to method for addiction. So then on top of that, when you apply it, when you apply to drugs and alcohol, these are known addictions that are endorsed clinically as addictions. But when you apply it to sexual behaviors, or love, love addiction is this another thing that's not endorsed. When you apply it to something that's not endorsed,
on love addiction, I can't bear that term.
Absolutely.
I had a current patient of mine who I don't see very much. We provide some psychosocial support, who came to me and said that their current therapist had said that they're a love addict because they'd started a relationship with somebody. I said, no, it's normal to start a relationship with somebody, and love addiction doesn't exist anyway. So I genuinely don't understand why a professional would want to say that to a patient. I don't know what the agenda is, to be honest.
It's common. People do it. It's just so common. People just reach for a label because it's just easier rather than just, being with the clients and just not knowing and just exploring. That's for me, it's so much more interesting. But a lot of people just want to put some labels on things.
I think there's an interesting issue here, and let's look at it, if you don't mind. It's about this idea of cultural competence and being in the community or outside of the community and what's best. And before you answer, let me sort of lay it out a little bit, because one of the things that does happen, and Baroness Black, who did a review of addiction services in the UK, made this point very clear, that there's been a dumbing down in addiction services in terms of clinical professional input. And the reason it's dumbed down partly is because of people who are within the recovery community being boosted into positions that they shouldn't necessarily be boosted into. So they're non-clinical people, but also because people will get clean and sober and then go off immediately and go some sort of therapy qualification in addiction therapy, and then go on to be addiction therapists when they've only had experience of 12-step recovery. And then they move in, they go sort of have a clinical qualification. They have nothing broader than that. The only model that they're taught in is this sort of Minnesota model. And that's all they have in their toolkit, to be honest. And then they impose it, but they keep coming back to their own personal experience. But it worked for me, And there's that. And then there's the other sort of issue, which is about, and that's one form of cultural competency, which I think goes badly wrong, to be honest. And then there's another form of cultural competency, which I think we need to talk about as well, which is that the sort of that you're talking about, where somebody from within a community can have a sensitivity to the issues that patients bring and an understanding. And so yourself being a gay male who then went off and qualified as therapist allows you to be more empathetic and understanding. Let's talk about that. How do we avoid this pitfall of ghettoization of service while providing a culturally competent service that doesn't fall into the dominant modality, which is oppressive? So any thoughts around that? I'm sorry, that's a really long-winded and difficult and huge issue, but I'm sure it's something that you thought about a lot, to be honest.
Well, I think you said it. I think we need better training.
Right.
Basically. And in my original training, there was maybe one module, which was maybe one afternoon on sexuality.
Right.
And there was nothing on sexual problems. There was maybe one afternoon on LGBT, which was put together with kink and other oddities. It's like it's like the freak module. And so, and the rest of it was about looking at case studies of white middle-class heterosexual people with problems, with depression or anxiety. And so I think that in the first place, we just need to start there. We need to start for the psychotherapy field to realize that now we are so much more of a diverse population, that everybody training as a therapist today, even if you are a heterosexual person thinking that you're going to be working with heterosexual people, you are going to be working with people who are not heterosexual. You are going to be working with people who are pansexual, bisexual, maybe heterosexual looking, but bisexual. Mm-hmm. And you're going to be working with people who are asexual and people who have different gender identities and people who identify as trans or non-binary, all of that stuff. And if you don't have adequate training, you're just going to be assuming some heteronormative ideas because that's the training. And then you are probably going to think you're doing the right thing because you're doing what you're trained for. So it's not the fault of the therapist in some ways. It's just that, if you don't know that you have the blind spot, you don't know you have the blind spot, right? And then you can actually do unintentional harm for the people that are not white and heterosexual.
Yeah. Would you say to a therapist identified as straight, stay away from working with clients from LGBTQ plus?
No, definitely not. I think that there is the space for LGBTQ people have the right to have the therapy space that's safe for them with any therapist they see. So if suddenly then heterosexual therapists say, I'm not going to work with these people because I'm not comfortable with it, it just takes away so much of therapy space. What I would say to heterosexual people is train up and skill up. It's our responsibility to be able to work with other human beings, the diversity of human beings. So people have to skill up.
And so that's again about the ongoing sort of learning new skills, continuing professional development, finding those spaces. So if you have patients that come in, I mean, ideally, we want to be learning from every patient that walks in our door. We want every patient to bring something in that makes us think, oh, I need to go and learn more about this, because that's a new aspect of functioning that I've not really thought about. And I want to learn with you. And that sense of, there's an equality of power, because the old model of therapy, which is, the analyst is there and you're the child and you regress, I think is debunked completely.
Of course. Even as as somebody that people would call me specialized in working with LGBTQ people, yes, fine, that's because I've got the experience and I identify with it, but identifying as a gay man does not mean that I assume that another gay man would have the same experience as I have. I'm still going to be curious about them.
Want to work with you or like you or anything.
Yes, exactly. So I'm still going to be curious about them and still going to be holding the fact that they that might have a completely different experience of being a gay man in the world than I have. But again, I think it's really important that all therapists do the right CPD in their blind spots about that. And again, I think pink therapy offers plenty of CPDs, so there's no excuse not to do them.
I know it well, so I know it does, and it's great. There's another issue, I think, and I think this is a broader issue about therapy in the UK. Like, for example, I'm a regulated professional through the Health and Care Professions Council. You know what I'm talking about. I'm relatively rare in the UK. As a psychotherapist, I'm legally accountable for my actions through this statutory body. The long history of this. And I'm not going to say anything other than there's been a big debate and the government have failed miserably to actually address the issue in the way that it should do. And I think there is a big issue about accountability within our profession, or lack of accountability, to be honest.
I agree.
And that brings us to issues such as this so-called conversion, so-called therapy. And why in God's name is it allowed? I mean, first of all, you tell me what it is. I mean, I know what it is, but tell us, the world out there, what this horrific thing is.
It's conversion, I said therapy, conversion practices. They are...
that's a much better way of saying it. Thank you. That's what I'm going to use. I've been struggling to find a word for it because that's what it's called, but I hate it.
That's what it's called, but it's practices, really. And let's say first that all of the, maybe not all, but most of the psychological and psychotherapy bodies in the UK have signed a memorandum of understanding to say that it's unethical to practice it. But it's not illegal in the UK yet. The government is making a move, but it's making a mess out of it at the moment. So that's a different story. But basically, conversion practices is the assumption that being heterosexual is the normal sexual orientation, and if you are not heterosexual, it is because of childhood trauma or because of something that's happened to you that made you not heterosexual. And if you treat those causes, then you can become heterosexual again, which is what nature intended. That is the assumption of conversion practices. Now, what we have found, because that's been practiced for a long time now, what we have found is not only doesn't work because we can't change people's sexual orientations, but also it causes major psychological traumas on the people that have been.
Yes, of course it does. So people end up killing themselves. Or acting out and killing other people. So it's suicide or homicide. It becomes the options, usually suicide.
Usually suicide, but if not suicide, definitely a terrible post-trauma symptoms. But suicide is the last bit of the road.
So it's really important, I think. And again, if anybody's triggered by this stuff, what would be a useful helpline? So if, say, somebody does think there's something really wrong with them and that they've seen a therapist which has suggested to them that the reason they're gay is because of somebody interfered with them as a child, which is usually the nonsense that comes out. It's usually associated with sort of paedophilia in some way, and it's horrific, the sort of link. Where would you suggest they could go in terms of helplines or support in terms of trying to deprogram themselves from that nonsense?
What I would say is to go to an LGBT specific helpline. So that will be the best place, because they will understand. They will understand what conversion practices are. They will understand the impact on it, and then they can signpost to a therapist that they can afford. So a
good organisation, I guess, would be Stonewall, for example. And
Stonewall, yes.
James can sort of put the link towards that, and they have support groups on there. So if you're feeling sort of, if somebody's been telling you these things, a so-called therapist has been telling you those things, give Stonewall a call, and they can put you in touch with support groups and therapy.
And there are some good LGBT charities like London Friend, for example, that can offer cheap or free therapy.
Okay, but I guess the message we both want to give is that these conversion practices are unethical, soon to be illegal, apart from trans people, which I don't understand the government's thinking on that, except there is a real significant backlash going on at the moment.
Yes, there's going to be another consultation from the government to review what they're doing, really. So I think it's sort of, I don't really know, to be fair. I think it's the government should not misunderstand, because the government actually did a really good review that's published on the government website.
Yeah, it was really great.
on conversion practices, and so they know how it's done. They know who is affected by it, and so I'm really quite puzzled as to why they've excluded trans people.
I don't understand as well. I mean, I'm sort of, I can only think it's somebody like Jacob Rees-Mogg has suddenly stepped in. He's an ultra-Catholic who is anti-abortion, for example, and it's quite significant in the Tory party at the moment, because he's part of the ERG, as was, which is now the Brexit group or whatever. But he's, people like that. He was always on the fringes before, a power broker, and he has these very strange views on life. But now he's right in the central government. So I can only think it's somebody like that has suddenly got influence.
And there's other issues as well about the government proposal, because they're also saying that if it's wanted, so if people consent to it, then it's not going to be deemed as illegal. But of course, what the government is not understanding is that people have so much shame about their sexual orientation, and that they can easily be coerced. And even though on the surface it might sound like they are consenting, they're not consenting because they're not having the right information. When I was in my early 20s, or even in my teens, and I was bullied at school, I wished I could be straight. And at the time, if a therapist was saying, yes, I can make you straight, I would have probably consented to it to stop the bullying.
It's a very strange notion of consent, and a very strange notion of capacity as well.
That's right.
It's also, I mean, I think it's quite odd to say people can consent to something which is psychologically damaging.
That's right. Yes.
So
there's lots of issues, and other countries have made a good, full, proper ban, and it's working. So I don't know why the UK is not able to do the same. Really, that's very baffling to me.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a very strange sort of backtracking on their part. In terms of the sort of backlash to the trans community, we are getting towards the end. We can't really cover it, but it horrifies me. I'm really upset by it, and I mean, I'm not upset by comedians making money out of Ricky Gervais's recent sort of comedy thing on Netflix. It's okay. You either find Ricky Gervais funny or not. So it's not that type of but the really important issues that are going on are, there's been magnificent strides in terms of reducing the death toll amongst young people going through adolescence who are trans. By mental health professionals who've been able to work compassionately with them, and because the death toll was horrific, you were talking. I mean, it's just unbelievable what was going on. It managed to deal with that.
Yeah, of course, and lots and lots of progress, which is fantastic. But within the LGBTQ kind of letters, the trans people are still the ones who are getting less good services, even with healthcare services and other places where they can be still pathologized or criticized for some reason or misunderstood. And so
does it remind you of the early days of sort of gay lib and sort of, when it was a risk to go on the gay pride march and stuff like that? It does to me. It has the similar sort of feel to that. But there's also, there isn't, again, people should understand this, there isn't one unified voice within that it is a community that's emergent, as it were.
That's right, and it's great that they can have a voice now, and it's great that they can actually, ask for their rights that they should have always had, and so they still needs plenty more, better, equal rights for trans people, and right now they're hurting with what's happening in the world. So yeah,
this is Pride Month. This is at the end of which we will have Pride in London, the march in London. So this is the month which people can, begin to explore support and celebration for themselves.
That's right. Yes.
And for yourself as a proud gay guy, is there anything in particular, on a personal level, that you're looking forward to in this month? Anything that you've noted in your diary, like I want to go to that? And so, what are the highlights for you of the month ahead?
Well, I'm organizing a queer lunch with some queer therapists all together so that we can celebrate the good work that we do for our communities. And that's going to be my celebration piece. But Pride is, for me, more than just a celebration. It's still a protest for getting the rights that we need, because there's still plenty of homophobia and there's still plenty of work yet to be done.
Absolutely. We are at the end of our hour for now, but it's been lovely to have you here, Silva. Just sort of, you're a very intelligent, you're a very kind and compassionate human being, and clearly motivated and clearly very involved in something that's close to my heart, because I've never been, as I talked to you before the show, I've never been that interested in becoming the world's best session therapist, in the dyad and learning all those things. I've always been much more interested in what happens when somebody leaves that space and goes out into the world. And I've always felt that draw towards what's going on in the world, because I think if we don't give people who come to our therapy sessions the tools that mean they can be better in that real world, then we're not really doing anything of any use at all. And I think, for me, one of the things is that social action and political action is something that is inherent in psychotherapy.
Yes. Absolutely. And especially working with LGBTQ people, you have to consider social justice, and it's something that we have to look at and talk to our clients about it, but also for our clients to feel that they can have a voice and contribute to their own communities as well.
It's this, for me, what it is you talked about it earlier on in the conversation. You and I both know that it's stuff that happens to you in the world that messes you up psychologically. And I can't in all conscience say, I'll put Humpty Dumpty back together again, just so you can go outside and get kicked off the wall again. It's not right, and I won't do it. I think we have to change that scenario. And
exactly. And that's why we still need Pride, because we still need ongoing healing, and we need ongoing healing because the trauma is ongoing.
Absolutely. It's been really wonderful, really refreshing for me to talk to you tonight, Silva. You stay there. I have to finish for now.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh no, we're going to bring you back in a few months' time and see where you're at, and actually maybe talk about some of the actual work you do with patients as well, because we didn't really get into that. So we got to much more.
It was a fabulous conversation this evening. Thank you.
Great. Lovely to have you on. You stay with us. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody for now, and see you all next week. So bye-bye here from the south of France to wherever you are. Have a lovely evening, everyone.